Thank you very much for having me back here. I was here at your opening a few years ago when Mike Rater was still with you. And I still see Mike from time to time. He does a lot of preaching workshops around the country. He's just been up in our neck of the woods. And thank you for bearing with the video. If you ever wondered whatever happened to poor old broken down former Deputy Prime Ministers, you now know what happens to them. They get put out to pasture. And from there they sort of wander around from theological colleges to, in Asia to theological colleges in Australia. Reporting back, that film was taken at home in about October of last year, and as I watched it I thought to myself, I can sense some of you appreciating the animals. It's a universal language, isn't it? And there I was with my wife and Impact, who's the cleverest horse I've ever encountered, and Sally, who's the sweetest horse I've ever encountered. When I left public life, I went home to spend more time at home and rapidly discovered that that was a problem for everybody. I was getting in the way. But my wife and 3 of our 4 children love horses. They spend a lot of time with them. And I did a bit as a kid, but we'd moved on to motorbikes for sort of stock work. There was a couple of those up there too. You know, they're much less troublesome. You fill them up with fuel and you start them and you ride them. Anyway, this got to the point where I realised that to have proper and deep communion with at least 3 of my children, I needed to do some riding as well. So my wife bought me a 5-year-old quarter horse, and we called him Dudley because he was a dun, and there was a famous Australian agriculturalist by the name of Dudley Dunn. Dudley and I had developed a terrific relationship. The high point of that was that there's a famous Queenslander who trains stock horses and their riders called Glenn, I can't think of it now. He's an old man, well into his 80s. And he was running a school locally, so we ferried backwards and forwards, you know, 4-wheel drive and horse floats. I think there were 3 of the kids, Julia and me, but we had 4 horses, including Dudley. And there were something like 32 riders and their horses at this 3-day, stock horse training thing. And I was delighted to, at the end of it, receive the prize whose name says it all. Dudley and I walked away with the most improved. So there you go. Matt, you talked about Megst, and of course a lot of that, what you saw up there, was in fact at Megst in Burma. And I just want to leave you with 3 thoughts this morning. The first is that we who have been rescued by Jesus Christ need to understand the enormity of it and understand very deeply where the heart of Jesus lies. The passage we were using over the weekend was from Matthew 9, where Jesus, having demonstrated his power in the miracles, and Matthew's point of recording the miracles, you see power over the environment when he calms the seas, people are terrified, power over evil, he casts demons out, power over disease, he heals the bleeding woman. You see power over the thing we fear most, death, and people are almost more afraid of his power over death raising Jairus' daughter than they are of death itself. And Matthew's saying, look at these miracles and recognise that they are clearly showing who Jesus is. This is no mere man as he is, this is God. And then Jesus, we're rapidly then given an insight into the heart of this extraordinary person. Jesus moved around the towns and the villages and had compassion on the people because he saw them as lost sheep, harangued and hassled. And then he says to his disciples, go out, the harvest is plentiful, and pray for labourers. Now I am a farmer, and there was a wheat crop up there with a couple of emus running through it. They're animals as well. They're not like Impact, who I said was a smart horse. I am told that on a pro rata, is that the right language? But allowing for size and weight, an emu has a brain 1/20th the size of a chicken. So if you thought chickens were dumb, I can tell you emus are really dumb. And you thought they'd look nice running through that wheat crop, and I'm thinking, how much more of the wheat crop are we going to lose? As a farmer, there's a couple of things about harvests that you might find interesting. The first is that on first instance it looks like thousands and thousands and thousands of plants with thousands and thousands and thousands of heads, as we call them, with thousands and thousands and thousands of billions of seeds in them. Sort of like a swarming mass. And we could be the same with people, but to a farmer it's not. It's important. It matters. And you want that harvest in. And there's a time when it's ripe to take the harvest. And what's more, it involves a lot of thinking, a lot of strategy. It involves a lot of hard work and grind, some of it less than pleasant. It's got better now, air-conditioned harvesters and all the rest of it. And these days it's amazing, you can be out in the paddock and the header plays up, so via cyberspace you talk to John Deere in Waterloo in the United States and say, the drum on the header's playing up, what do I do to fix it? And they'll tell you, and sometimes I'll even fix it from there. So much as the world changed, but it's a sophisticated thing that requires a lot of input and a lot of players. You need a harvester, you need people to drive the harvester, you need pickup bins, you need trucks and people to operate them, you need silo operators, you need financiers to make it all work till the harvest comes in, and then hopefully you make a profit. It matters though that you have the people to do it and the strategy to manage it, and the farmer wants the crop. How much more then does the Jesus who saved us, deep in his heart, want us to recognise that he wants his harvest brought in too? And his harvest, we could see as just the mass of humanity out there, or we could be worse, we could say some parts of the harvest matter more than others. We've just had demonstrated in that that chapter of Matthew that no, that's not right. You had a woman who was unclean and an outcast, who would have been very unpleasant company and all the rest of it. Nobody would have wanted to have known her. And he loved her and responded to the tiny bit of faith she showed and healed her. You had a high official, Jairus. He cared about him too. No distinction. No distinction. Same with that harvest out there, those souls. They're people. They're not just grains of sand on a beach or grains of wheat in their heads out in the paddock. There's a deep compassion. Deep at the heart of the Christ who first loved us is that concern for those people out there. That's the first point I just really want to try and nail for you. The second point I want to say to you is that we then need to think carefully about what that might mean. The world has changed massively. At the time that my family on both sides came here in the 1830s, Christianity was a European religion. And the world was starting to think, particularly of the great age of the evangelicals in England, to single that out, to think about reaching the rest of the world. And people thought expansively, strategically and bravely about how to do it. And it was real grind getting in the harvest in those days, sending out missionaries in creaky old ships, sometimes never to see home again, to live and serve their lives out, being labourers, bringing in the harvest. And oftentimes they saw no fruits at all. And other times in amazing places like China, it all appeared to have been lost when the missionaries were expelled. In reality, that is not what has happened at all. That is not what has happened. The reality is staggering. We live in a highly secularised country where the people who essentially run, and I use this word carefully, massively censor the public debate, don't want you to know, not interested in, have no cognizance of the reality that the world is now a place where there is enormous interest in Christian things, in religion in general. This will not be an age of secularism or of atheism, as so many in our society would like you to believe it will be. That actually, if you get a really helicopter view of the world, is a very self-indulgent view held by a few academics and intelligentsia and unfortunately some of the people who control the national debate and have a great influence over the education of our children and university students. But it's pretty self-indulgent because it doesn't really stack up in terms of what's happening globally. The truth is, of course, that this coming century will be a time of enormous ferment and debate about beliefs and creeds, how we live our lives. And we're in danger in the West, frankly, instead of leading it, of being sidelined in it. So let us as Christians be smart enough to know what is really happening, to recognise that God is not mocked, and he's got a harvest out there, and he is sending labourers out into it, and we need to pray about what our involvement as labourers might be, what it might look like. There have never been more Christians in the world today. The numbers are staggering. And what's more, the growth is staggering. It's no longer a Western religion, it's a religion of the East and the South, and wherever else God has been active. And Stuart Brooking, who's here with me, well, I'm with him actually, and many of you will know Stuart from Overseas Council Australia, tells me that there are 35 million Christians now in Indonesia, the country that the media doesn't understand, and when it does, talks about it as being Muslim, or attacks it in various other ways. The country to which 700,000 young Australians go every year to Bali, and 56% of them think they're in the country of Bali. We don't understand what's happening. But there's 35 million of them following Jesus Christ, and more coming in through the door every day in staggering numbers. They need pastors, they need teachers, they need harvesters and labourers in the field. And what a wonderful thing that so many people from places like Australia have gone there to serve in many capacities. But can I say to you, think logically and strategically through this. There are good theological colleges there, and what we do at OCA is we get behind them. That's our particular view of mission. It's our take on it. We don't bring people here or send people there. We get behind those young people. You saw them very briefly there from Tyrannus, which is up in the mountains east of Jakarta, essentially, if you look at a map. And they're great young people training for a lifetime of ministry in their own districts, in their own communities, their own churches. That is an incredible thing. And so it is that there are about 25 colleges around the place that we support, a magnificent one in Papua New Guinea, in the Highlands, in a very, very beautiful setting. It's on a farm, and it's a well-run farm, crops and animals. And I went there and I was staggered. Then they told me that the teaching of the theology was even better than the farming. So I thought I'd better go to school there. It was terrific. And then there's Myanmar. Now that's an interesting place. 60 million people. It's known horrendous oppression. The Second World War was dreadful for them. The Japanese occupation was almost beyond comprehension. And then they were briefly under the enlightened rule of the British, and I don't say that smugly, that is what they told me, for just 3 years, and then they ended up under a military dictatorship. You can feel the oppression today, but it's starting to lift. And even in that Buddhist country, they're excited about what the future might hold. There are 100 Bible schools in that place, but Megst, we believe, is an outstanding one, and it's terrific that you're thinking about supporting it. And you saw some of the students there, and I thoroughly enjoyed. I have to tell you, I got quite emotionally involved with those young people, and as they begged me for advice, you know, as how do they as Christians not only minister to souls, but to carry their responsibilities to seek justice and job opportunities and build a nation for their own people. How do they do it? My friends, we need to think this through. We need to understand the heart of Christ for mission. If we understand how he loves us, we'll understand how he loves our neighbour as well and what that means. We need to understand how much the mission field has actually changed. If it's 35 million believers in Indonesia and exploding every day, I was up there just the other day, as a matter of fact, and I got to preach in a church, 6,000 people in a middle class, probably slightly upper middle class, it was reasonably wealthy. They had this massive plasma screen. They told me it was the biggest one in the Southern Hemisphere. I mean, it was enormous, absolutely huge. And they had the biggest picture, now don't die at this, the biggest picture I've ever seen of me on it. And unfortunately, it was taken a few years ago, and you know, humour is universal. There was a young Indonesian fellow who looked at me, he looked at this massive picture, he looked back at me and he said to me, "How long ago this photo taken?" Spin is universal too, because the writing beside it had in small print, "We welcome our guest," massive print, "John Anderson," tiny print, I'm glad not too many people saw this, especially in Canberra, tiny print, former deputy, and then in massive writing, Prime Minister of Australia. I literally didn't know whether to laugh or cry or shake with fear. And it was an amazing experience to preach to thousands of people in that country through a translator, and then have people coming up to me, picking me up on my English, because they all understood anyway. You know, they're smart and they're sophisticated, and they got a heart for Christ, and we're missing it in Australia. But I just want to say to you, the final point is that we do need to think very, very carefully, recognising how much the world has changed, how we, with the incredible repository of scholarship, of biblical knowledge, of theology and all the rest of it that's been developed in the West over the hundreds of years, if our society is losing interest in it, and we mustn't give up on our society, but let's be hard-nosed about this, let's go where the harvest really is, as well as focusing on our backyard. If our society is less interested in it, can I say to you, we should redouble and triple our efforts to make sure that the good things we have, and there's a lot of them, are made available to people in the emerging churches in the emerging world, because they're hungry for it and they need it. And as the famous Os Guinness said, I had a conversation with him a couple of years ago, many of you will know who Os Guinness is. He said that one of the great tasks for Western Christians is to equip the emerging church, not just for Christian growth, but to cope with the corrosive effects of modernity before it sets in. And he actually said, one thing they need to watch, some of them are a bit arrogant and say, no, that we'll never be like the West. But they will be if they're not equipped to avoid the mistakes that we've made in our pride and our arrogance and our slothfulness. And I say that as one who loves this country and loves its people, is broken-hearted by the way the West has turned its back on the Saviour who created the society that we take for granted. So, some thoughts there for you. Overseas Council Australia is a mission organisation that I have the privilege of sharing. We have a long-term relationship with quite a few of you. We're deeply appreciative of that. Our model of mission essentially is to do what we can to provide consultancy help, information, backgrounding on how to set a college up, how to run it properly, integrate with the churches of the local community and that sort of thing. And we work in about 25 colleges around the place, mainly in Asia. Secondly, we can provide resources as they need them. It might be a new library, it might be, you know, a satellite dish, it might be a dormitory, it might be something like that in the fabric line, if you like. Thirdly, we do bursaries, because in many of those countries, take Indonesia, there are more than 20 million millionaires in Indonesia. You know, there's a lot of wealth in that country, and many of those people are Christians. But like some of our well-to-do Christians, they haven't joined up the dots yet. They're not funding properly their own church growth. Well, we can still help, because a lot of what that means is that there's a lot of young people who want to serve Christ and be pastors and leaders and teachers. They don't have the money, their families don't, and their churches don't. So we provide a channel, and for a couple of grand a year, you can feed and clothe and educate a young person training in ministry in most of the colleges that we support. My wife and I have been doing it. It's an incredible privilege. Young Jeffrey graduated the other day. He's not in Asia, he's actually in Nairobi. Well, he was training at Carlisle College, and for about $7,000 over a few years, my wife and I can now sort of wave him goodbye as he leaves Nairobi, so to speak, and goes out into pastor in his own country amongst his own people for probably 50 years. And when I was in Indonesia, there were 16 young people there who said, greet the wonderful Australians who are making it possible for us to be here. So that's the sort of work we do. God bless you for your interest. Let's do what we can to secure a better world for our children and grandchildren, because that's what it'll be as Asia Christianises. But most importantly, let us respond to the heart of Christ, who wants to see the harvest brought in.